Word to the club.
We are now recording. All right. Check us out in the pandemic. All right, good morning, everyone. You're here today to participate in an LGBTQ plus training. My name is Kenya, and my pronouns are she, her, and ella, and I'll be walking you through this morning. So our planned time today is about an hour and a half. And again, please feel free to stay on mute, type in any questions, and we'll check in periodically. Okay. So what does it look like today? We're just going to take a moment to do an introduction. We're going to go over what does LGBTQ mean and like the different letters that form this acronym and what that looks like. We're going to talk about the differences between sex, gender, and orientation. We're going to focus on language and why it's so important, especially dealing with this population. We're going to take a moment just to bring up some clinical competencies and then talk about some tips on how to create a more inclusive workspace. And at the end, we'll go over some resources and then have some time for Q&A. So welcome everyone. If you are on Zoom, this is a great opportunity to be able to change your presentation name using your pronouns if you're aware of what they are. If not, we're going to go over that in a little bit. So I just welcome folks to do that if you're willing and able. Maintaining on video is also helpful just to share the experience with everyone. And I like to start off all my trainings just with a land acknowledgement, especially being in Southeast Alaska. I just want to honor that we are in the Tlingit land and that we just kind of honor and respect the legacy and traditions that is before us. So we keep that in mind as we're talking about identities and what that looks like, and stigmatization and trauma, just kind of keeping an eye towards that history and how it intersects with everything that we do. So this by no means is an encompassing training. This is a huge topic that changes quite often. So this is just meant to set a foundation, hopefully to maybe answer some questions and set the tone for further learning. We want this to be a learning space, a respectful place. If you do have a question, it is okay to ask any kind of question. Just be mindful that we are trying to create an inclusive learning space, and give yourself permission to understand that after today, you'll have more awareness of what that looks like, but it is okay to be in a learning, respectful space today. So with that being said, this statement comes from a Safe Ally training called Safe Zone that really focuses on helping folks to be allies for all kinds of LGBTQ folks. And basically what this says is you're free to be you. We walk in this room with different experiences, with different cultures, with different traditions, with different understandings, and that's okay. We have permission to kind of be who we are in this space. And we have permission to be imperfect with regard to people who are different than us. It's okay if I don't know all the answers about LGBTQ issues, or if I know anything at all. My ignorance and misunderstanding becomes obvious. So please understand that we are in a learning space and that it is okay. There are no dumb questions. And we're asking for a bit of vulnerability when it comes to saying it's okay if you're not sure of something or if you don't know something. I have permission to ask questions that may appear stupid. I have permission to struggle with these issues and be upfront and honest about my feelings. I'm a product of a heterosexist, heteronormative, homophobic and transphobic culture, and I am who I am. And what that speaks to is the primary culture of expectations of being straight, male, female, a lot of those dominating terms that we see in society. So that's what that's reflecting. I don't have to feel guilty about what I know or what I believe, but I do need to take responsibility for what I could do now. So things is trying to learn as much as I can, struggle to change my false or inaccurate or oppressive attitudes towards lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, and working to create a safer world for everyone. So if we could kind of be in that space, I welcome all of you to this training. All right, let's get right into it. So, what does LGBTQ mean? There's a lot of different words out there. So what this is an initialism that stands for primarily lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning. And you often see this with a plus at the end. The plus kind of represents other sexual orientations that we come to know, and what is the rainbow community or the queer community, which are also terms that you might hear when we're talking about LGBTQ. You might also see the full verbiage in kind of academic text that looks like that, LGBTQQIAA, which is a mouthful. So it's okay if you don't recognize that. Most commonly, you will see LGBTQ+, and that is kind of the most common recognized acronym. So understand that you don't need to memorize this. This often changes. How it's presented in different forms can also change. So again, just understanding that this just represents letters for the different communities. And we're going to go over some of these a little bit more in depth. So the 2IA plus in LGBTQ is something that I want to bring your attention to, especially being in Southeast Alaska. We want to acknowledge our Indigenous population. So the 2 stands for TwoSpirit. You'll also see this as 2-S in some settings. And what this is a contemporary term that connects today's experiences of LGBT, Native Americans, and Indigenous people with the traditions from their cultures. So it's very common in Native cultures that you have that like nature is masculine and feminine, but there's 2 versions of self, 2 versions of spirit. So that is how it shows up in this work that we do. So I think it's important for us to kind of keep that in mind, and that brings in and of itself a whole different kind of verbiage and culture around that when we're dealing specifically with Indigenous folks. Intersex, a group of rare conditions where the reproductive organs and genitals do not develop as expected. Some prefer to use the term disorders or differences of sex development. Intersex is also used as an identity term by some community members and advocacy groups. So as we've talked about, that this is always changing, it's always evolving. There used to be another term for this kind of early on in the 70s and 80s. It was called hermaphrodite. Some folks still use that term. It's now like not a term we want to use. It's a derogatory term. So this is kind of the evolvement of that. And then we have asexual, which describes a person who experiences little or no sexual attraction to others. This is not the same as someone who is celibate. So we're looking at attraction. And that's a big percentage of our LGBTQ family. So it's important that they're recognized as well. And then as an example of a plus, we have pansexual, which describes the sexual orientation of a person who is emotionally and sexually attracted to people regardless of gender. So we're going to get into what the differences are between gender, gender identity, sex, sexual orientation, in just a little bit.
So if I can say something, if you will go back to the TwoSpirited, a lot of times a grandfather or grandmother will refer to their grandchild not as being part of an LGBTQ community, but just as being TwoSpirited.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to recognize the comfort level of folks. There are definitely some folks that just embrace that what it is. There's not like a label or a stigma put on top of it. However, in some tribes or in some specific areas, it is seen as an extremely negative thing, and kind of awful things have happened to folks because of that. So comfort level, understanding the importance of that is definitely things to take into context, 100%. And we'll talk a little bit more about that awareness and how that helps us work with our clients. I'm just going to take a pause real quick to see if there's any chat. Okay. So sex, gender, and orientation. So I really like showing this graphic when we start talking about this, just because I think I'm a visual person, so I think it kind of helps to put some context kind of in a more digestible sense. So a lot of times when we hear sex, we are talking about biological sex. This is chromosomes. This is the sex that you're assigned at birth. So that verbiage is also important. If we think about folks that were intersex, they had to be assigned a sex at birth. That could definitely be different later on in life if the sex that was chosen is incompatible with how they see themselves or how their body reproduces later. So that's what we talk about when we're talking about sex. It is just biological. Gender is more expansive than maybe we were even taught back in the day. This is definitely something that continues to evolve, but basically, gender describes our internal understanding and experience of our own gender identity. So this is how one relates to themselves. Okay, so this has nothing to do with sex. This has nothing to do with biological sex. And this can be vast. There's a lot of different genders. We're going to talk about that. We have gender fluid or gender neutral folks that identify as queer, cis or trans folks, third or cultural, which again is something we see in other cultural populations as well. And then orientation. So this is in terms of sexual orientation. This is the direction of one's affection. You'll also hear, and this is evolving, that sexual orientation is also now can be often referred to as affective orientation. Who do we show affection to? So sexual orientation is a person's emotional, physical, and sexual attraction and the expression of that attraction with other individuals. So we want to stick with sexual orientation instead of sexual preference, because that implies that it's a choice and that sexual attraction is kind of something that this person is choosing to do. So something again that we've kind of have stepped away from. And this is their sexual orientation or affective orientation. So a little bit more on gender. So again, gender describes our internal understanding and experience of our own gender identity. So these are some common gender identities. Cisgender, who's heard of that in this room? So cisgender are people whose gender identity aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. So straight, heteronormative folks. We'll also say they're cisgender. So I was speaking with someone one time and they said that they were filling out a form and they didn't know what to pick. They were like, I'm straight, I don't know what box to check in this situation, and they had cis on there. So I think it's a term that not everyone may know, and that's okay. So transgender are people whose gender identity differs from the sex they were assigned at birth. Many transgender people will transition to align their gender expression with their gender identity. However, transition is not necessary for you to be transgender, so it's important to recognize that. And then non-binary. So as we mentioned kind of earlier, we have this like standing kind of cultural man, woman, straight, gay, like binary that just exists. So in this work, we kind of look at where you step outside of that, we see things more on a spectrum, and a gender of non-binary, meaning that these folks do not see themselves in that girl, boy, man, woman binary. So these are folks who experience their gender identity and or gender expression as outside of the male-female gender binary. Many other words for this identity outside of the traditional categories of man and woman may be used, such as gender fluid, gender queer, polygender, bigender, demigender, or agender. And I know that's a lot, but just know that all those are very different, and the person themselves would be able to kind of talk to you about what that means for them. Okay. So understanding that gender is identity, which is how we view ourselves in relation to society. Expression is how we show it to folks. And attribution are what people assume about us. So if I'm dressed, if I have on a dress, someone's going to assume in some way that I'm feminine or I'm female. Or maybe not. Oh, that good addresses.
What was that last word you said?
Attribution. Oh, whoa, sorry about that. This mouse went a little crazy. Okay. So sex, we talked about this already, is literally, we're talking about the anatomical, the biological, anatomical, hormonal, and genetic traits used to categorize someone either as male or female. So that's pretty much all we talk about when we're talking about sex in this field, is literally what was assigned at birth. Gender identity and sexual orientation are two separate aspects of someone's identity. So going back to gender identity, internal knowledge of themselves as either a man, woman, or another identity, identifying as transgender refers to one's gender identity. And then sexual orientation refers to who you're attracted to. just as a recap. So again, think of all of this as happening on a spectrum. It's not just black and white, not just male, female, not just masculine, feminine. And this chart is going to help us with that. So what we have here is just a diagram of the spectrum of sex, gender, and sexuality. So just a word on sexuality. Sexuality runs on a continuum itself. It's not static throughout our lives. If you just think about like how we were when we were an adolescent versus being in our early 20s versus being in our 30s and our 40s and our 50s. So there's natural changes and there's potential to change throughout our lifespan. Okay. So sexuality doesn't really fit in like one category. So I think it's important when one of the major shifts when we kind of get into this frame of thinking is kind of removing ourselves from that binary, that simple black and white. So I encourage you to take a look at things through a spectrum. So for example, bisexuality exists at many points along the sexual continuum. So it would be really, really hard to kind of pinpoint if someone was struggling with that, like what box that would fit in, if that makes sense. So we have here on the top with biological sex, what we see as a normative woman or a female, normative man, male, with intersex folks kind of in the middle. Gender identity, we have the binary at the poles with the fluidity in the middle of gender identity. Gender expression, we have masculine and feminine at the poles with varying degrees of androgyny in the middle. And then sexual orientation, attracted to men, attracted to women, and then attracted to different genders throughout the spectrum. And then sexual behavior, right? So it's important to remember that that can happen independently of orientation. So sex with men, sex with women, and then sex with folks on the continuum. So I hope this chart kind of helps to put into, again, just a visual of to kind of get us out of that black and white binary. Okay, so I'm just gonna pause right there for a second and just check the chat. How many chats? Any questions so far? Okay, we'll keep going then. All right. So one of the most important things to focus on in general is our language, how we say things, the words we use. So language shapes the way we think and determines what we can think about. I love this quote. I often show this quote when I start therapy with a new family because I focus a lot about we're really good at thinking first and putting feelings second, but our words will always give us away. So, and this is important for us as providers, because if we're using words that could be harmful, a youth or a family is not going to trust us. So it's very important that we're mindful of our language or the impact of our language. Okay, I don't know what's happening here.
You have a chat?
Oh, I have a chat. Okay, we have a question. We'll totally address that in a second. Okay, so let's get into it. Names. So names can seem gendered. And some transgender and non-binary people may choose a new name, a variation of their old name that might align with their previous name to fit their gender. So it's important to recognize, and a few of us might have seen this already in the work that we've done, that whether or not a person's name has been legally changed, the best way you can be supportive of someone who is transgender or non-binary is by honoring the name that they're asking to be called by. This is the number one most important thing, and it's literally life and death. This could save someone. Calling someone by their proper name or pronouns is one of the best things we could do in terms of suicide prevention when we're working with LGBT youth. Uses of chosen names resulted in a 29% decrease in suicidal ideation and a 56% decrease in suicidal behavior. For youth of color who are also LGBTQ+, these numbers doubled. It decreased by almost 50% and 86% in suicidal behavior. That's how important this is, just acknowledging someone's name or pronouns could save their life. So if you take anything out of today, I think that's really, really just important to recognize. So there's a couple of different things. We have their birth name, which is a name assigned at birth. And then we have two different terms. So we have lived name, which is basically the name that they are living today. This is the name they have chosen. And then a dead name is when they've officially changed their name. The dead name is the old name that was part of their old identity. So an alternative to preferred name is this lived name. So again, we want to stay away from language that kind of minimizes who they are and emphasizes choice. So when you say preferred, you're like, oh, you're choosing that. No, they're living their truth and this is who they are, so we need to respect who they are. Okay. And sometimes you'll also see if someone is non-binary, instead of seeing like Mr. or Miss, you'll see MX, which is just like a neutral gender kind of nomener for folks. Okay. Okay. So pronouns, we're kind of going back to school a little bit. These are integral to who we are. We want to share our pronouns so everyone in the room can know, and it creates a comfortable space for those to also then share their pronouns. We don't just want to assume someone could present a certain way. Their expression might be one way, but their gender identity might be another way. So sharing our pronouns really presents that opportunity for folks to be respected and put it out on the table. So when we share our pronouns routinely, we demonstrate that we also recognize that that's important. And again, using someone's correct name and pronouns is an important way of affirming someone's identity and is suicide prevention. Sorry, y'all, this mouse is.
Sometimes it's just.
There we go,
too
sorry
far
about
away.
that.
Yeah.
There we go. So here's some examples of pronouns. Now this gets super into like syntax. I apologize. But the reason we show it this way is just to show what it looks like So she, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs. These three on the bottom, you may not see, and we might not see in our work here, but these are out in the community. These are gender neutral forms of pronouns. So I just want to introduce them here in case folks have never seen them before. And again, if we're having that conversation about pronouns, folks will let us know. And it's totally okay if you make a mistake. If someone tells you their pronouns, and if they're like, I use they, them pronouns, and you're like, can you hand her pen? And you can be like, I apologize. Can you hand them their pen? It's okay. We're gonna make those mistakes. I think what's important when we're in this space is just acknowledging that we're trying, and that this is a learning space. But the best way, honestly, is just use the person's name. And did you know that there's an International Pronoun Day, the third Wednesday in October? And this year it falls on October 20th. I just thought that was really cool. That's relatively new, so just a sign of like evolving and like acceptance. I just thought that was a pretty cool thing to bring up. So asking someone their pronouns. So again, we want to stay away from the word preferred. So these are some really good examples. What pronouns do you use? May I ask what pronouns you use? When I refer to you, what pronouns should I use? Are you comfortable with sharing your pronouns? So this is super important because this ties into safety. So keep in mind that some people may use certain pronouns in some contexts and not in others due to a variety of factors, including safety. So for example, we've had youth in our programs that were able to be their full selves with us in the program, but when they were interacting with their family, they couldn't use the pronouns they were using in program with their family. That's a safety thing. So understanding that we kind of have those conversations, we asked about that. Because we never want to accidentally out someone. So it's just important that we kind of keep that in mind. It's something extra for us to think about, okay? And just, again, phrases to avoid preferred or preferred name as a suggested element of flexibility, and it could be kind of invalidating for folks. All right, so we're gonna practice. And Jen, you brought up a really good example earlier. I think a lot of folks struggle with they, their pronouns because it could seem like we're talking about multiple people. So it kind of plays a head game on us at times. So would love someone to participate with me. So we have the they, them pronouns on the side, listed 1 through 5. And then this could just be an example of how we use those. Who would like to read one of the sentences?
Sure.
All right, sorry.
They laughed at the notion of gender binary.
Sound right? All right, what about the second one?
I got you covered. They tried to convince them that asexuality does not exist.
Perfect. How does that sound? Does that sound weird? Does that sound correct?
Sounds right. Sounds like proper English. I would say, like,
Right.
I mean, you could use that language in a book and it would work.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's important because especially with they, them, theirs, it seems like it's a mind game, or it could just be kind of like, wait, am I using the right one? Am I talking about more than one person? But actually it is a singular. And to your point that, yeah, it's, if someone's like, hey, so here, oh no, they're not here, right? It's something kind of very that we actually kind of say quite often, but maybe we don't pay attention to it until we kind of have these conversations. So thank you for that. How about the third one?
I got you. Their favorite color is unknown.
Perfect. How does that sound? Does that sound okay?
Yeah, it sounds pretty normal to me as well.
Okay, awesome. All right, how about the fourth one?
The pronoun card is theirs.
Right, theirs is possessive, like that's their stuff, right? Kind of common. All right, one last one.
They think highly of themselves.
Does that sound reasonable? Awesome. Well, thank you all for participating in that. Just wanted to highlight that this has been and is part of our natural language. I think sometimes we might, we might be overthinking it or kind of are cautious about wanting to make sure we're saying the right thing. So again, just remember that it's okay if we make a mistake. Asking someone about their pronouns is going to be the best thing that we can do. And if all else fails, they have a name, just ask them. Thanks, appreciate it. Awesome. So I'm just going to stop right here real quick.
You click on the chat, you
Yeah,
got a
you're
question
right.
already there.
So Jared, do you mind if I share your question?
Yeah, this is a good question.
Go for it.
Okay. So we have a question that says, would it be fair to say that queer is functionally the same as two-spirit, but viewed through a Native American spiritual lens? That's a wonderful question, Derek. Thank you so much. Yes, that is an accurate statement. And we had a little bit of conversation with this earlier around some tribes culturally do embrace this and is not seen as an issue. It's a very natural thing because nature has both good and bad, masculine and feminine. So it's seen as a very natural kind of state of being. Some do acknowledge it as being queer or something outside of the norm. So it could be stigmatized and, issues that come with that. So yes, when we're thinking about that, we recognize that that's how our Indigenous folks encapsulate that for themselves. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so clinical competencies. Name is Mouse or? Okay, so I just wanted to take a moment to talk about the work that we do with our youth, with our families, and just acknowledge how, again, language is super important. So you're going to hear this term of linguistic competence. This is going to be the one thing we really, really need to work on. Making sure that we're using the gender affirming language for folks. Even as I said this journey, you'll hear me say folks a lot. You'll hear me say y'all. Everyone thought I was from Texas at one point. It's just a way of acknowledging all identities in our room, right? It's a way of being neutral. And I just think that's super important, again, to kind of show people that hear that may not know if it's a safe place for them to kind of talk about those things, can pick up on those things and say, hey, Okay, well, maybe they're cool with that. Let me see if I can talk to them about that. So, learn the safety context of your clients. So, we see this more often in residential just because they're with us. But we've seen this in community work as well. But if they are identifying as transgender and they're requesting to be referred to by their live name, then we need to honor that. And that becomes part of the work that we're doing with them clinically. And knowing that there might be some trauma associated with that. They might have been in situations where they might have come to their family with this information and it was less than a pleasant experience. They might have one safe person that, you know, is part of this. So it's really important that we talk about that. We try to honor that. We talk to them about what this looks like if, say, their parents are not comfortable with that. Okay, we're gonna have a phone call with your parents. I just want you to know that I want to respect your safety. So we're gonna use your birth name during this phone call, but I want you to know that I respect who you are and I just want to make sure you're safe during this situation. Understanding the risks and protective factors for suicidal behavior. So again, just respecting names, pronouns, understanding the safety factors, creating a safer space for folks to be able to discuss these things is going to be a form of suicide prevention. So also for folks that have any trauma related to sexual trauma around their gender identity or sexual orientation, understand that that already kind of puts them at a higher risk. So understanding their safety and what they're going home to is super important when they're in treatment. So understanding the intersectionality of LGBTQ plus youth. So intersectionality just means that all these different factors can impact one thing at a time. So if we have a youth that is Indigenous, comes from a lower socioeconomic status, and is presenting with us with trauma and addiction, and is also transgender, if you can imagine like the layers of stuff that we kind of have to deal with. There's cultural stuff, there's environmental stuff, religious concerns, traditional concerns. So it's not just clear, cut and dry. We have to acknowledge all those different peels of the onion, basically. So understanding that that's super important. And to that question that was just asked, right? Perhaps this person from their tribe or their clan, it was totally accepted. Maybe that's not the biggest concern. But all these other issues are. We know that youth that are LGBTQ plus have a higher incidence of being victimized. So kind of understanding that is super important. And just creating safety in general. I don't care if you're an accountant and you're walking through residential, just being mindful that we want to invoke an environment of safety at all times. And as an example of why language is so important, 68% of LGBTQ youth heard teachers speak negatively about LGBTQ youth and issues in school. That's a lot. Like, think about how much time you spend in school. That's a significant part of their day. 56% of them heard negative remarks about LGBTQ issues and people in their own family. So understanding that that could be detrimental. For youth of color, these numbers again, almost double. So it's important to recognize that intersectionality of how things pile up for folks. Understanding that we have our own implicit bias. We were raised a certain way, we have experiences. We kind of have our own filter, good, bad, or ugly, right? Like we just kind of have our own natural way of looking at things. So understand that that's a thing and that's important, right? We can't just say, oh no, I don't see color, or oh no, I don't see sexual orientation. That is the most damaging thing you could do to someone. That completely nullifies their experience and their existence. We need to be willing to say, maybe I need to work on that. Maybe I need to read up about that. So educating ourselves is going to be part of this process, and it's ongoing because, as we've already discussed, these things do change. Competency and scope of practice. So for folks that are, our clinicians, our practitioners, our consultant, understanding that this is a competency. We have to learn about this. We have to get good at using the right language, at being okay with making mistakes, at practicing these things. Admitting when you're wrong. And understanding this might be outside of what I could do, because that's also important to recognize. And then cultural influences. So part of our own implicit bias, I put it here separately because this is super, super important to recognize that we bring a culture, we create a culture at our agency, at residential and outpatient. So understanding how all those systems interact with each other, and are these systems being competent to LGBTQ? So just a word on intersectionality. This is Marsha P. Johnson. She is the reason we have Pride. Pride exists because of a Black woman, because of a Black trans woman, because of a Black trans woman who was a sex worker, because of a Black trans woman, Black bisexual trans woman who was a sex worker that threw a brick at a cop. Pride exists because of a Black bisexual trans woman who was a sex worker that threw a brick at a cop and started a riot against the state. So this was in the late 60s, the Stonewall riots in New York. Kind of came to a head with all the civil rights stuff that was happening. And this was the line in the sand, kind of the beginning for LGBTQ rights. So I just want to acknowledge that there is always going to be thoughts or stigma or just ideas that maybe we might be uncomfortable with, and that's okay. It's what we do with that and what we do with that awareness to push forward that is like what we're focusing on here. So I just thought it was important to recognize this, recognize Martha and where Frank comes from. So. Sorry. Okay, creating an inclusive workspace. So what can we do to create this culture here at JYS? Continued training, right? Again, this is just like a fundamental intro. If there's something you saw here that you're like, you know what, I'd like to learn more about that. Get some training on that. If there's something that you didn't see here that you were expecting to see here, let's talk about that, right? Let's get some training around that. Asking questions, it's super important, right? We have permission here to look silly, to ask dumb questions, to ask a question without a filter. I think that's super important in these learning spaces, and just be able to be curious and being in that learning mind state. Use gender neutral or gender inclusive language. So what that looks like is in Zoom, putting your pronouns. Inclusive language describes relationships. So instead of saying boyfriend, girlfriend, you could say spouse or partner, those kind of things. Little changes in our language that just can portray a sensitivity and a safety context in our culture. Update forms to show inclusive options. So doing a little work with this with AK Ames and changing our intake packets around how do we ask the gender question? How do we, are there just two options for sex, or is it a line? What does that look like? Update the interview processes to include inclusive scenarios / culture. So maybe having a question around working with LGBT+ youth to just kind of see where the comfort level is. And support and advocate for a safe and inclusive workspace. So this kind of comes to like, you hear someone telling maybe an inappropriate joke and being able to go to that coworker and be like, hey, that, I kind of didn't appreciate that. That doesn't really kind of go with their values and what we're trying to do here. Things also like gender neutral restrooms. If there's like one restroom, it's the restrooms, right? You don't necessarily have to put a personed placard on it. And to just kind of wrap up and take a look at what we're doing. These come again from the Safe Ally training. And these are the 10 best ways to be an ally. I will read a couple and then I'll ask folks to read some. So first and foremost, don't assume everyone is heterosexual. Be aware that transgender and intersex people exist. So you might hear this referred to as heterosexual privilege, heteronormative. The fact that we just kind of assume, or that might be our first go-to thought, oh, Blake has wife, Piper's husband, just kind of coming from that heteronormative stance and understanding of like, oh, that's great, are you bringing your partner, right? And not just assuming. Don't ever out anyone. Just because you might know, don't assume that others do. So again, having that conversations about pronouns and safety and like where it's okay. Avoiding anti-gay jokes and conversations, creating an atmosphere of acceptance, using all-inclusive language, actively pursue a process of self-education. So reading, asking, ask questions, taking a training. Have someone read 7 for me?
Acknowledge and take responsibility for your own socialization, prejudice, and privilege.
Awesome. What does that mean to you?
Owning up to your own shortcomings.
Absolutely, right. Kind of our awareness that like we come with that implicit bias, right? That like I might make a mistake, I might say the wrong thing. I might have leeway in one conversation with someone, and I assume I have leeway in all conversations with folks. Right. So understanding that that I own that. It's our accountability. Educate others through one-on-one discussions, group programming, teachable moments. So we all kind of heard like of cancel culture and of like just being done with folks when they do stupid things. But I think it's really important when we talk about utilizing teachable moments, that we take an opportunity to call in someone instead of calling them out. So like if something kind of inappropriate happened, you could step to that person on the side kind of afterwards and letting them know and utilize that moment as a teaching moment. Because we know that if you're gonna come at it with like a, you know, kind of aggressive kind of tone, we're not trying to hear that, right, as people. But if we're really trying to change the culture, being able to have those call-in moments, utilize moments to teach folks, maybe they're unaware. Maybe they didn't know what transgender means. Maybe they didn't know what that looked like, right? So like taking a moment just to be like, hey, just wanna let you know, this felt a little awkward, let me tell you why, are you aware of this? Interrupt prejudice and take action against oppression, even when people from the target group were not present. So this is just in terms of creating a culture, right? Like, we would hope that as you kind of grow in this space, that if you're hearing someone be inappropriate or make some sort of comments towards a friend or a youth or family of LGBTQ, that you're gonna kind of step up for them and speak for them, even if they're in the room or not. Even if you're at work or not, like ideally, right? Kind of just making that change. Which kind of just ties into the last point of having a vision of a healthy multicultural society. I'm going to email to everyone the list of these resources. These links are awesome. There is a glossary link that is right here. If you're curious about terms or like history of terms and things like that, UC Davis did this really, really awesome job. I would encourage you to take a look at that. There's also information here for families. There's a foster parent handbook. There's a coming out handbook for youth. There's some really cool things here that I encourage you to take a look at just on your own time. But if you don't look at anything else, I would definitely encourage you to look at the glossary just to familiarize yourself with terms in case there was some questions that you didn't feel like asking. And that is the slideshow. I just want to open it up to folks if you have any questions.
So if you're meeting with a family and the child identifies one way and the parents are not accepting, how do we counsel them?
So that's a really good question, depending on your role, right? So we actually recently had that situation in residential. If you're not doing it through like a therapy session where like the goal is like, you know, this is what we're working on. I would encourage you to talk to the youth first and just say, hey, we're having a conversation with someone who may not be the safest. I want to protect you in that space. So for example, got a client who was whose grandma was just not on board
Right.
with any of that. And unfortunately, we needed to talk to her and we needed her support. So the youth was very well aware of that and actually had a lot of anxiety whenever they needed to talk to their grandma. So it's just supporting them like before those conversations of like, I'm gonna honor and respect your identity and your pronouns right now. We're walking into a situation where we know that's not safe. So I apologize that I can't use your lip name right now. And let's get through this. And hopefully, you know, the bigger goal of that is hopefully that's something they can work out at family therapy. But that is part of of the issue and the safety concerns, right? Because that youth then went home to grandma. So what does that look like when that battle is happening? So much so that they went home, they had to change their whole wardrobe before they got home. Like it was a full-on acknowledgement that they cannot be their true selves at home. So really tying them with resources, letting them know, and if you have an opportunity to debrief afterwards. Like, so how did that conversation go? Like, how are you feeling? Making sure you're using their pronouns. And just kind of putting them in a sandwich. It is a rough situation. But I always just like to say, hey, we've talked about safety before. We're coming into a space where it's not safe. So we're gonna do what we need to do to make sure that you're safe in this situation. I'm gonna check in with you afterwards. But yeah, it's devastating to see that. Especially when like that's like the issue, right? Like it would just be so much helpful if they had someone supporting them.
And then when we have co-ed residential, are the children we placed as the sex they're born as or their identity?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'm assuming that it would be assigned at birth. That's just my assumption, but that's a really good question. I don't know what the plan is for residential.
Well, I think what's helpful sometimes when we have a youth that's identifying as not their sex assigned at birth, then it's less so like, are you Montana Creek or Northern Lights? Like you're in Lighthouse, so you kind of have the opportunity to identify and express how you're aligning with who you are without like being like, well, you're not expressing enough to be in Lighthouse or Montana Creek. So I think it gives us a little bigger kind of options for the youth to feel more comfortable.
I agree, definitely in terms of like culture, like I think it's a really great thing that we are having a colored house. Because it could really, because that's not the question anymore, right? Like that's not the criteria.
Yeah, like they'll be at Lighthouse regardless. I mean, wherever their room might be, I don't think that might be taken into consideration, but like it's less so of a choice now because it's not separated by sex.
I think that's a bigger, like when we look at like just struggles in general or like bigger challenges, that's definitely something we see in like other institutions for LGBTQ folks that like it then becomes like, they're hiding again or they have to like tone down an expression or kind of revert back to an unhealthy space for them because of those barriers that are in place. Anyone have any questions?
A few. So mine, this also comes from my implicit biases as well, and what I don't understand. I guess one I want to talk about is what I don't understand is pansexual. What's the difference between pansexual and bisexual? And then, not for the sake of making an argument, but couldn't I say in terms of spirituality, right? My loved one, no matter if she was a man or transgender, no matter what, I'm in love with her soul. Why wouldn't that make me pansexual as well, right? And not saying that to try and make an argument, but I guess how does that differentiate?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. I think that's really important to recognize that, so a pansexual is someone who has a sexual attraction to anyone regardless of their gender. So if there's someone who could fall, let's say that they are attracted to someone who says they're gender fluid. Regardless of what that anatomy looks like,
Right.
that's not like, that doesn't matter. But to your point, when we talk about sexual orientation, sexual attraction, right, what is that thing that they're actually looking at? What is,
Right.
and that is something that is evolving.
Right, well, then how is that different than bisexual?
So bi just means two. So when you're bi is in the
Oh.
binary of male and female.
Mm.
So for example, there are folks who are bisexual who would not be with someone who transitioned, for example.
Okay. All right.
So like kind of we're looking at gender as a binary,
Right.
male or female.
Right, and now that's my follow-up question to that, is I can visually see, I've had, you know, lesbian and gay people and bisexual people and transgender people in my life. I've seen them, I've known them. I don't understand I don't understand queer or questioning or any of the plus after that, as I was saying, pansexual. And part of it probably is my implicit biases of me seeing sex as binary, just, you know, that way. But okay, queer and questioning, how do they always stay in that category? And that's the thing, are people, do they shift between these letters in terms of how they evolve or how
Absolutely.
they grow up?
Absolutely. So we talked about things being like on a spectrum and how things change over time. So you could have someone who is just not feeling, they are not in alignment with their, with like the shoulds, right? Like
Right.
you're a genetic male, so you should be attracted to females, right? Like dominant culture, you should be heterosexual. So when you're something different than the dominant culture, things come up, right? Okay.
Right.
So when you start exploring, and folks like to name that, like that could be super important for someone to say, you know what, I'm questioning.
Okay.
And that could just be something very therapeutic for them to say, like, you know what, I kind of didn't know what I was, and maybe I grew up in a really religious household, so I was supposed to be this, and like I didn't know, like, and sometimes just having a name for it can be super like cathartic. Like, wow, okay, I'm not alone. There's a thing, questioning. Okay. Folks typically move from that. Maybe they recognize there's a gender fluidity. Maybe they recognize that they're actually bisexual, or maybe they recognize, you know what? Nope, I'm gay. I'm lesbian. So they can be transitional and oftentimes are. And you might even notice, and you might see this with our youth, they might try using different names, different pronouns. And they're kind of trying to find their way into like what fits for them. So in that sense, for someone who's maybe not used to seeing that or trying to understand like what's happening, it could be, that's super important for us to really recognize their language. Because if we just stick to what they're saying, it takes our bias out of it. You know what I mean? Because we could be like, well, just yesterday they wanted to be called Tom, and
Right.
today they're Tina. Like, okay, yeah, okay, Tina. How you doing today? What pronoun should I use to address you? Awesome, thanks. And if that's a daily conversation, then that's a daily conversation.
Okay.
There's a great
Yeah.
Linus one, little Christmas short that he wants to write a Christmas card to this girl. And she changes her name every day. So he finally says, well, I'm just gonna write her and send it off to her. But it comes back to him because there was no name on it. And Lucy goes and says, well, why are you even trying? And he goes and says, well, she fascinates me. And it's one of the little Christmas shorts, and with how and it just like popped in my head, that whole conversation that he had, well, yesterday I was Lydia, today I'm Daphne, tomorrow I might be Susan. And he's like, well, I'll just write her. Comes back and Lucy's like, well, why? Oh, she fascinates me. So it's that whole like, where are you at today?
Mhm.
And that actually is partially answers another follow-up question I had. So you had parents that are not accepting, right? But let's say we have parents that are accepting, but they still generalize, they still see it in binary as gay and straight.
Mhm.
How do we help our parents educate and see that who are accepting? At this point as well?
What are they accepting of?
They're accepting that their youth is, and they don't have, again, they have the implicit biases and they don't have the education and the knowledge on the background of it. So they see their youth as being gay, right? But their youth is not wanting to be labeled as gay. They are maybe questioning. How, but the parent can't see it that way, because exactly what you said.
Yeah.
Yesterday they were Tommy, today they're Susie, now I don't, and how do we help a parent with that as well?
I think one of the really great things about this is that the youth oftentimes can teach us a lot more of what's going on. So in that situation, I would kind of empower, I would want them to like seek out some information, right? Like, hey, like this is what LGBTQ means. What I've done in the past is if someone is very stuck on a binary, like gay or straight, like, okay, this is what gay could look like. And then that's how I introduce the different gender identities, the different sexual orientations. That the G then kind of becomes like the big category. That could be overwhelming to folks. They may not be on board right away, even if they are supportive. I would empower them to have a conversation together of like, I don't understand yet, but I'm trying. I understand that you're not straight, right? And maybe
Right.
like not put that label on
Right.
it. But if there is support there, there's room to like have those conversations, to provide that education, and honestly have the youth talk about that. Like, I know that it's different if they're comfortable with saying that word, or I'm not sure what it is either, and this is what it looks like for me. Can be very powerful for the parents.
Right.
To be like, oh wow, yeah, I don't know anything about that. Let me read a book here. Let me get some education around that. And hopefully that would be the goal. Like if we were in those positions to provide that information to parents, like how great is that in like this therapeutic space, That's super awesome.
I think pansexual, when I was learning all the terms, was the hardest one for me to understand as well. And then I met someone who identified as pansexual and, just asked her a lot of questions like, help me understand that. And it didn't make any sense until she said she could love someone who is asexual. And I was like, what is asexual? Which is someone who is not sexually attracted to anyone.
I didn't even think about it that way.
And
I
then
didn't think
also-
someone pansexual could be attracted to someone who only loves themselves.
Yeah, so
That's
then she
interesting.
loves someone who's not sexual at all. She just loves the person.
So what,
Yeah, we have a question at MC.
Hi. I just had a quick question about some logistical parts of this in residential. Of course, we're gonna take steps to be inclusive always. However, there is the boundary of the sex assigned at birth to where we are able to house them safely. And so I just wanted to ask that question, if we have a youth who feels very strongly about one way, we would not be able to house, or would we be able to make special accommodations to house them in the opposite gender?
I
That
feel
would
like
be my question.
I feel like it'd be the same issues that we have had with some of the female youth that have been attracted to each other at Lighthouse. Kind of really the same issues, right? in terms of making sure that obviously they're not roommates or they don't share the same bathroom together, and they are in sight and sound of us to be, they're not left alone one another. I agree though, that those come up in my mind too, where what bathroom is that youth going to use? What hallway is that youth going to sleep in? And those are logistical things that will come up on a case by case basis. And that's actually what I feel like is the main theme of all of this is like, it really is case by case, and we need to understand that each person has different unique likes and dislikes and feelings and orientation.
And I think to that point also, like having the co-ed unit,
Yeah.
to that conversation earlier might alleviate, seems like the wrong word, but might help to facilitate that in some way. I think it's important also, like expression is one piece of that. So if you have someone who is expressing a gender identity that's different than their sex assigned at birth, that's also then an opportunity to create that culture of safety in the home.
Yeah.
So, it really, and I think youth are a lot more open to that than maybe adults. So that's an opportunity for us to be able to create that space of acceptance and understanding that there are limitations, right? That these are one of the barriers, unfortunately, that do exist that can be stigmatizing and traumatizing for them as they move forward in life as well. And how can we best support them in their expression and helping them feel safe, understanding that there's this kind of systemic like block in place would be the best thing.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Another one. So for TwoSpirit, if a person was just lesbian or just gay, in a spiritual native element, would they be part of the TwoSpirit
I guess that would
acronym or category, I should say, sorry.
depends how they identify, right? So like they could be indigenous and just say I'm lesbian,
Right,
like totally, yeah.
but
Choose-
would they fall under then just lesbian, or does TwoSpirit encompass all of that, or is that,
if they choose to identify that way.
okay,
So someone who's bisexual can also be lesbian, right? If we
right.
think about it that way.
Yep.
But they're not identifying that way, they're identifying as bisexual. So if someone who's indigenous identifies as lesbian, then that's their letter, you
okay,
know? Whether or not within their clan or their home tribe that they represent them that way is a whole nother thing. It's how they see themselves.
okay.
Yeah.
And then my last question, I'm sorry. The uncommon pronouns ze, xe, and ve, where would we see those? Is that culturally? Is that geographically? Are we gonna see that in different parts of the world or different parts of the country?
You might see those. Those are kind of prevalent on like the East Coast a
Okay.
lot. I spent some time in Boston, and you see Zers a lot. And again, it's just a neutral, gender neutral term to replace she, he.
Okay.
And it is cultural, like in Europe, they use that a lot, they use versi. So they're less common for us, but just wanted to be aware that they are out there and that basically it's just a gender neutral term to replace she, he. And like what that would look like.
There's a bar in P-Town that has those as its name. So, but P-Town is a very
Yeah.
open town.
Yeah, and if you're like in this work a lot, or if you do like additional trainings and stuff like that, like I had I had a trainer whose pronouns were Caesars. And that one was kind of like a tongue twister at first, and it was, oh, that's Zer's conference. Like it took a minute because it was something I was unfamiliar with. But it was just so commonplace for, I mean, the conference was in Massachusetts, like it was very common for that out there. So culturally, and kind of going back to the question of queer. So interestingly too, geographically, that could be an issue. So for example, in the West Coast, like that's not a thing.
What's not a thing?
Queer isn't a thing.
Okay.
Like it could be seen as a derogatory term
Oh, okay.
in a lot of populations. Whereas like on the East Coast, it was very open, like, oh yeah, they're queer. So it could also be used as a term to describe just LGBTQ plus folks. But some folks just do identify as queer and own that in a very positive way. So I would, again, ask because there are like geographical differences and cultural differences around that.
On the East Coast, they have taken back and re-empowered.
Yeah, they have re-empowered here on the East Coast, absolutely. Yeah, Pride in New York versus Pride in San Francisco are two different.
Pride in Keytown, the Florida of Massachusetts, Miami.
Yeah. Right.
All of those great ones.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Do we have any final questions?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time and attention. Hope this was helpful. Have a great day, everyone.